Michael Carter sat in the courtroom, his hands clenched together. His heart pounded as he looked around. He had never imagined himself here, accused of a crime he didn't commit. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes, adjusted his glasses. The jury members sat quietly, waiting for the trial to begin. The tension in the air was heavy. Michael's lawyer, Sarah Williams, leaned over and whispered, "Stay strong. We'll prove the truth." She was confident, but knew this wouldn't be easy. The case was complicated, and the odds were against them. On the other side, Richard Coleman sat with a smug expression. He was a well-known lawyer, famous for winning big cases. But his methods weren't always honest. He glanced at Michael and smirked. To him, this case was already won. Michael's opponent was a wealthy businessman. The accusations against Michael were false, but money had power in court. Richard knew exactly how to use it. The judge banged his gavel. "Let's begin." Michael took a deep breath. His life depended on this trial. He had no idea what Richard had planned. But karma had its own way of balancing things. Richard leaned back in his chair, watching the courtroom unfold. He had handled many cases like this before. Winning was easy when you had money and power on your side. His client, a wealthy businessman named Thomas Reed, had everything to lose. If Michael Carter walked free, Thomas's reputation would be destroyed. Richard wasn't going to let that happen. Later that evening, Richard made a private call. "Judge Harris, we need to talk." His voice was smooth, confident. The judge hesitated. "About what?" Richard chuckled. "Let's not play games. You know this case should go my way." Silence. Then a sigh. "Richard, I can't discuss this." "Sure you can." Richard leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You'll find a package waiting for you tomorrow. A generous gift for a favorable verdict." Judge Harris remained quiet. Richard took that as a good sign. "Think it over," he added. "I'll be in touch." The next morning, a black briefcase was delivered to the judge's office. Inside was a thick stack of cash. No note, no explanation. Just temptation in its purest form. Richard smirked as he sat in his office. The judge had two options: take the money and seal Michael's fate, or refuse, and make an enemy out of one of the most powerful lawyers in the city. For Richard, the choice was obvious. But he had underestimated something. Karma never misses its mark. Judge Harris sat alone in his office, staring at the briefcase. The room was silent, except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. He knew what was inside before he even opened it. With a deep breath, he unlatched the case. Stacks of crisp $100 bills stared back at him. It was more money than he had ever seen at once. He swallowed hard. He had built his career on fairness and integrity. But this was tempting. One verdict, one decision, and his life would change forever. No debts, no financial worries. His hands trembled as he shut the case. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of the situation. Richard's voice echoed in his head. "Think it over." He knew Richard Coleman wasn't a man to cross. The lawyer had influence, powerful friends, and a ruthless way of handling problems. If Harris refused, there could be consequences. But if he accepted, he would be no better than the corrupt lawyers and judges he had spent years fighting against. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant peeked in. "Court starts in 10 minutes, sir." Harris nodded. "I'll be there." As the door closed, he glanced back at the briefcase. The choice was his. But deep down he knew, every choice comes with a price. Sarah Williams had been practicing law long enough to know when something felt off. In this case, something wasn't right. Richard Coleman was too confident, too relaxed. He acted like the verdict was already decided. Sarah had seen corrupt lawyers before, and she had a strong feeling Richard was up to something. She needed proof. Late that evening, she stayed behind in her office, reviewing case files. Her assistant, Daniel, walked in. "You should go home," he said. "I can't shake this feeling," she admitted. "Richard is playing dirty. I just don't know how." Daniel hesitated. "I overheard something earlier. Richard was talking to someone on the phone about a package." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "A package?" Daniel nodded. "Didn't say much, but it sounded like he was making a deal." That was enough for Sarah to start digging. She went through records, checked past cases, and even looked into Richard's financial history. But the real breakthrough came the next morning. As she walked by Richard's office, she heard him speaking in a hushed tone. She slowed her steps, listening carefully. "The judge hasn't responded yet. But he won't refuse," Richard was saying. No one says no to that kind of money. Sarah's heart pounded. She quickly pulled out her phone and hit record. This was it. Proof that Richard had tried to bribe the judge. She took a deep breath. Now, she just had to use it at the right moment. The courtroom was silent as the trial continued. Michael sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly. His future rested on this moment. Richard Coleman stood with confidence. He smoothed his suit and walked to the center of the room. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began. This case is simple. Michael Carter is guilty. Sarah clenched her jaw but remained calm. She knew Richard's confidence came from his dirty tricks, but he didn't know she had proof. Richard presented his so-called evidence, twisted facts and manipulated witness statements. He spoke with certainty, as if the trial was just a formality. Michael felt his heart sink. The way Richard spoke made it seem like he had already lost. Then it was Sarah's turn. She stood, adjusting her glasses. Ladies and gentlemen, she said firmly, this case isn't just about Michael Carter. It's about truth and justice. She glanced at Richard, who smirked. He still believed he had already won. Sarah took a deep breath. Your Honor, I have new evidence to present. Richard's smirk faded slightly. Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Yesterday, I recorded a private conversation that changes everything. The courtroom shifted with whispers. Judge Harris sat up straighter. Sarah pressed play. Richard's voice filled the courtroom. The judge hasn't responded yet, but he won't refuse. No one says no to that kind of money. Gasps spread through the room. The jury members exchanged glances. The judge's face darkened. Richard shot up from his seat. Objection, that recording is... Sarah cut him off. Illegal, inadmissible, or just the truth? She stared him down. You bribed a judge, Richard, and now, everyone knows it. Silence filled the courtroom. Judge Harris exhaled slowly. He looked at Richard, then at the jury. For the first time, Richard looked nervous. He had played the game too many times, but this time, he had been caught. The tides were turning, and karma was about to strike. Richard's face turned pale as the recording echoed through the courtroom. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Judge Harris took a deep breath and leaned forward. Mr. Coleman, do you deny this is your voice? Richard straightened his tie, trying to regain his composure. Your Honor, this is clearly a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? Sarah interrupted. Or an attempt to corrupt the legal system? Her voice was sharp. This recording proves you tried to bribe a sitting judge. The jury whispered among themselves. Even the spectators in the courtroom exchanged shocked glances. Judge Harris turned his attention to Sarah. Miss Williams, how did you obtain this recording? Sarah stood tall. I overheard Mr. Coleman speaking in his office. I recorded the conversation because I suspected foul play. She glanced at Richard. And I was right. The judge nodded slowly, his face unreadable. He turned to Richard. Is there anything you'd like to say? Richard swallowed hard. His usual arrogance was gone. Your Honor, I was simply... Before he could finish, the courtroom doors opened. 2 uniformed officers walked in. The judge motioned toward Richard. Take him into custody. Richard's eyes widened. Wait, you can't do this. I'm one of the top lawyers in this city. The officers approached. Richard stepped back, but there was nowhere to go. You're also a disgrace to this profession, Judge Harris said firmly. Bribery is a crime, Mr. Coleman, and no one is above the law. Richard shook his head in disbelief. This isn't happening, but it was. The officers grabbed his arms. The entire courtroom watched as Richard Coleman, once untouchable, was led away in handcuffs. Michael stared in shock. Just minutes ago he thought his life was over. Now the man who tried to destroy him was being taken down. Sarah turned to Michael and gave him a reassuring nod. Justice was finally on their side. Judge Harris cleared his throat. We will now proceed with the case, but this time the law will be served fairly. Richard had played a dangerous game, but in the end, karma had the final word. The courtroom was still in shock. Richard Coleman, once the most feared lawyer in the city, was gone, dragged out in handcuffs. But the trial wasn't over yet. Judge Harris straightened his robe. He turned to Michael Carter, who had been silent throughout the chaos. Mr. Carter, you have been accused of a crime, but given the recent events, this court will reevaluate all presented evidence. Michael held his breath. Sarah stood up. Your Honor, the prosecution's case was built on lies. The so-called evidence against my client was manipulated. She turned toward the jury. Now you see how far they were willing to go to win. If they were willing to bribe a judge, do you really think they wouldn't fabricate evidence? The jury members nodded. They had just witnessed the truth unfold before their eyes. Judge Harris sighed. He looked at Michael. Mr. Carter, you are free to go. All charges against you are dropped. Michael's eyes widened. I'm free? His voice shook with disbelief. Sarah smiled. Yes, Michael, it's over. Tears filled his eyes. The weight that had been crushing him for weeks was finally gone. He had prepared himself for the worst, but now, he could breathe again. Judge Harris wasn't done. He turned to the prosecutor's table. This court will launch an investigation into Mr. Coleman's past cases. If this corruption runs deeper, we will find out. Michael exhaled, his hands shaking. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Justice always finds its way, she whispered. As they stepped out of the courtroom, reporters swarmed them. Cameras flashed, and microphones were shoved in their faces. Michael, how do you feel? One reporter asked. Michael took a deep breath. Like I have my life back. Meanwhile, Richard sat in a cold jail cell, staring at the wall. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his reputation destroyed. He had spent years bending the law in his favor, but in the end, karma had caught up with him. And this time, there was no one left to save him. Michael stepped outside the courthouse, feeling the sun on his face. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't afraid. He was free. Sarah walked beside him, proud of what they had accomplished. Are you ready to get your life back? She asked with a smile. Michael nodded. More than ready. The news of Richard Coleman's downfall spread fast. His law firm cut ties with him immediately. His clients vanished. Former cases were reopened, and investigators found more evidence of corruption. Richard had spent years manipulating the system, but now, the system was coming for him. Meanwhile, Judge Harris took action. He reported everything to the authorities. He knew he had made a mistake by not speaking up earlier, but now, he was determined to do the right thing. Sarah became a hero in the legal world. Other lawyers praised her bravery. Clients trusted her even more. She had taken down one of the most powerful lawyers in the city, not with money or influence, but with the truth. As for Michael, he finally got to move forward. He reunited with his family, who had stood by him through everything. He had almost lost everything, but now, he had a second chance. Standing on the courthouse steps, he took one last look back. Justice had won, and karma had done its job.